You're listening to the Alpha's Love Stories, romantic audiobooks that will make your heart race. Don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting love tales. The forests on the edge of the kingdom of Viridia were ancient and deep and full of whispers of old magic and older wars. It was here, in this liminal space between the ordered stone of the werewolf packs and the scattered villages of wary humans, that Elara Thorne made her home. Not a home for herself, but a shelter for the lost. The Haven, they called it, a simple, sturdy house of timber and hearth smoke, standing defiant against the creeping mist of the woods. At 28, Elara's life was not her own. It belonged to the children, the orphans, the abandoned, the little souls tossed aside by conflict and fear. She was human, and that made her an oddity, a puzzle. How could a woman with no wolf in her blood, no keen senses or primal strength, possibly understand the needs of a werewolf pup? The doubt was a constant low hum in the background of her life. But the Alpha King himself, the formidable Lysander Blackwood, had placed her here. He had seen her, years ago, kneeling in the mud of a refugee camp, soothing a terrified child whose eyes glowed faintly amber. He saw not a human, but a heart that refused to look away. His decree was her shield. But on a night like this, with the wind screaming through the pines like a thing in agony, even a royal decree felt as flimsy as parchment. Inside the Haven, warmth fought a stubborn battle against the cold. 8 children, ranging from toddling pups to a serious-eyed boy of 12 named Leo, were settling for the night. The fire crackled. Stories were whispered. Then the world outside shattered. It wasn't just wind, it was the sound of a hunt. Snarls, razor sharp and close, the sickening crunch of splintering wood from the village below, and beneath it all, a sound that turned Elara's blood to ice, the guttural, rolling growl of a wolf not just angry, but enraged, pure fury given voice. The children froze, their eyes wide moons in the firelight. Leo moved instantly, shepherding the younger ones into the back room, his own small body tense. Elara's mind raced. Bandits, a rogue pack. She barred the heavy oak door, her hands trembling only slightly. The Alpha King's protection meant nothing to lawless teeth. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. Not a snarl, not a howl. A whimper. Desperate, frail, and impossibly close. It came from the back of the house, from the door that led to the woodpile. A scratch, then a thud, as if something heavy had slumped against it. Every instinct screamed at Elara to stay put, to protect the children already inside. But that whimper, it was a child's sound. Holding her breath, she crept to the small, fortified window beside the door. She wiped a circle in the frost and peered out. The moon broke through the clouds for just a second, and in that silver light, she saw her. A female werewolf, her fur matted with dark, glistening blood, one arm twisted at a horrible angle. She was crumpled in the snow, her breath pluming in ragged gasps. But her arms were curled, not around her own wounds, but around a bundle clutched to her chest, a bundle that moved. As Elara watched, the woman's glowing amber eyes, dimming like dying embers, lifted and met hers through the glass. They held a universe of pain and terror, and a pleading so profound it was a physical force. The wolf's lips moved. No sound came, but Elara read the word on her dying breath. Please. The decision was made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She unbarred the door and hauled it open, the freezing wind whipping her hair. The woman almost fell into her arms, a dead weight of fur and fading warmth. Elara stumbled back, pulling her inside, kicking the door shut against the pursuing night. She lowered the woman onto the stone floor by the hearth. The children peeked out, silent tears on their faces. "Leo, blankets, now," Elara ordered, her voice surprisingly steady. But the werewolf mother was not interested in blankets. With a final, shuddering effort, she pushed the bundle she protected into Elara's hands. The cloth fell away, and Elara looked down into the face of a newborn pup. He was tiny, perfect, his skin flushed, but his eyes were not the hazy blue of a human newborn, nor the soft amber of a wolf pup. They were a luminous, piercing silver, like liquid mercury, and across his forehead, down his tiny arms, were marks, not bruises, not birthmarks, swirling intricate patterns of deepest black, like ink spilled under his skin, forming symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. A collective gasp came from the children. Leo took a step back. Ilara, his eyes, the marks, the stories say, he whispered, his voice trembling. Hush, Ilara cut him off, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. The stories. Every child in Viridia knew them, tales of the marked ones, cursed pups born under ill omens whose very presence could bring ruin to a pack, monsters in cradles. The mother's hand, now more human than wolf, gripped Ilara's waist with surprising strength. Her touch was cold, her gaze locked on Ilara's, pouring every last shred of her fading spirit into that one look. Kale, the name a bloody bubble on her lips. His name is Kale. They are coming for him. Do not let them take my son. Hide him. The light in her eyes flickered and went out. Her body went still. Just like that, she was gone, leaving Ilara alone on the cold floor, holding a baby with silver eyes that now stared up at her with an eerie, knowing calm. Outside, the sounds of the hunt were getting closer. Shouts, howls of triumphs. They were searching for her, for the dead mother, for the baby in Ilara's arms, the baby whose very existence was a death sentence. The Alpha King's protection protected the haven, but would it protect this, a child straight out of a dark legend? The logical part of her mind, the part that kept 8 other children alive, screamed that she had to give him up, to open that door and hand this dangerous burden to the wolves outside. But she looked at Kale. His silver eyes were not monstrous, they were confused, scared. He was just a baby whose mother had just died protecting him, and whose last wish was entrusted to her. Ilara Thorne made her second impossible decision of the night. She bundled Kale close to her chest, his silver eyes hidden against her shoulder. She looked at Leo, at all the frightened faces. "We tell no one," she said, her voice low and fierce. "No one knows he is here. He is just another orphan. Do you understand?" They nodded, their fear now mixed with a fierce, protective loyalty. Ilara moved quickly. She covered the mother's body with a blanket, a silent promise to honor her later. Then she took Kale to the hidden cellar, the one even the king's inspectors didn't know about. As she descended into the dark, the baby made a soft sound, not a cry, a coo. And as she reached the bottom step, she saw it, the black marks on his skin. They were glowing. A soft, ethereal silver light, pulsing gently in rhythm with his heartbeat. Ilara's breath caught. What had she just brought into her home? And more terrifyingly, who was coming to take him away? The cellar was a tomb of shadows and stored roots, but for now it was the only sanctuary they had. Ilara worked by the faint, unearthly glow of Kale's own skin, her hands moving with a frantic, tender precision. She cleaned him, swaddled him in the softest wool she could find, and tried to still the tremors in her own soul. The silver light from his marks illuminated the fear in her eyes, but also the stubborn set of her jaw. Upstairs, the world had gone quiet, too quiet. The hunt had passed by the haven, its deadly focus perhaps moving deeper into the woods. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was a waiting thing, a predator holding its breath. For 3 days they lived in that suspended silence. Kale, to Ilara's profound relief, was just a baby. He fed hungrily on goat's milk, he slept, he woke with tiny mewling cries. His silver eyes watched her with an intensity that was unnerving, yes, but also held a simple, animal trust. The glowing marks would flare when he was upset, casting shifting silver patterns on the cellar walls, and subside when he was soothed. It was magic, undeniable and strange, but it seemed tied to him, to his tiny emotions, not to malice, not to a curse. Leo became her conspirator. the serious boy moved with a new gravity, standing guard at the windows, inventing games to distract the younger children from the new baby sleeping in Alara's private room, a fiction that felt paper-thin. He brought extra firewood without being asked, his eyes constantly darting to the tree line. "They're still out there, Alara," he murmured on the second evening as she warmed milk by the hearth. "I saw a scout at the edge of the clearing. He was just watching." A cold knot tightened in Alara's stomach. They weren't giving up. The mother's warning was true. They were coming. But who were they? The local pack guard? Rogues? The answer arrived on the morning of the fourth day, not with stealth, but with officialdom. A heavy knock thundered on the front door, not the frantic scratch of a dying mother, but the assertive pound of authority. Alara's blood ran cold. She had just settled Kale, his marks thankfully dormant, in a woven basket behind a curtain in the main room. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm her, and opened the door. 2 werewolf bards stood there, their formal leathers adorned with the crest of the high pack, a mountain peak under a full moon. The older one, a grizzled warrior with a scar through his brow, named Torin, gave a curt nod. The younger one couldn't hide his nervous energy. "Miss Thorne, we are investigating the incident 4 nights past. A fugitive was pursued. We have reason to believe she may have sought shelter here." Alara kept her face a placid mask. "A fugitive? I heard commotion, of course. We barred the doors. It was terrifying for the children." She let a shiver enter her voice, a natural reaction for a human in a world of wolfish violence. Torin's sharp amber eyes scanned the main room, missing nothing. The sleeping children, the tidy hearth, the curtain fluttering slightly in the draft from the door. The fugitive was a female, recently whelped. She carried an infant. Did you see her? It is of utmost importance. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she was sure they could hear it. Recently whelped. She thought of the dead mother in her woodshed, waiting for a burial she hadn't dared to give. "I saw no one, Captain, only heard the sounds. They faded into the woods." It was a gamble, a lie woven with threads of truth. The younger guard shifted. "The infant, ma'am, it would be distinctive." A tiny sound came from behind the curtain, a soft, sleepy sigh. "Kale." Both guards' eyes snapped toward the sound. Torin's nostrils flared. "You have a new charge, Miss Thorne." Alara's mind raced. Denial was impossible now. A foundling, left on the step 2 days ago. A human child, from a nearby village, unable to care for it." The lie tasted like ash. "May we see?" Torin asked, and it was not a request. It was an order, polite but unyielding. Every fiber of Alara's being screamed to throw herself between them and the curtain, but that would be a confession. With legs that felt like water, she walked to the basket. She prayed to any god that might be listening. She pulled the curtain aside, and there was Kale, blinking his silver eyes open in the sudden light. The black marks on his skin were stark against the white linen. The reaction was instant and visceral. The young guard recoiled with a choked gasp, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword. Torin's face, weathered and stern, went pale. All the color drained away, leaving his scar a livid white line. He didn't reach for a weapon. He took a step back, as if from a venomous snake. "By the old gods," Torin breathed, his voice full of a horror that was centuries deep. "The marked one, the prophecy, it's true." "The abomination," the young guard whispered, his fear twisting into something uglier, revulsion. Alara found her voice, wrapping it around a courage she did not feel. "He is a baby, an orphan. He needs care, not your superstitions." Torin tore his gaze from Kale to look at her, and his expression was almost pitying. "You do not understand what you hold, human. Those marks, that silver gaze, it is the sign of the Shadowborn, a bloodline erased from history for the ruin they bring. This child is not just cursed, he is a curse." His voice hardened. "You will hand him over, now. His fate is for the Alpha Council to decide." Alara's arms instinctively closed around the basket, pulling it to her chest. Kale, sensing the tension, began to fret, a low whimper building in his tiny throat. "No," she said, the word quiet but absolute. Torin's eyes narrowed. "No? You defy a direct order from the High Pack Guard?" "This orphanage operates under the direct decree of Alpha King Lysander Blackwood," Alara fired back, her voice gaining strength. "No child under this roof is to be removed without his express command. You know this law, Captain Torin. If this matter is so grave, then take it to the king. Let him decide the fate of an infant, but you will not take him from me on the basis of old wives' tales and fear." The standoff crackled in the air. The younger guard looked ready to pounce. Torin studied her, this small, defiant human, shielding a basket with her body. He saw the truth in her eyes. She would die before she simply handed the child over. And she was technically correct about the king's decree. A muscle twitched in Torin's jaw. "You are playing with forces you cannot comprehend, Miss Thorne. You invite a storm into your home." He pointed a blunt finger at Kale, whose whimpers were rising to a cry. "That is not a child. It is a harbinger. Protecting it will bring death to your door, to all these children's doors."
"His name is Kale," Alara snarled, tears of fury and fear now pricking her eyes. "And he is under my protection. Take your petition to the king. Until I see his seal on an order of removal, this child stays." Torin held her glare for a long, terrifying moment. Then he gave a sharp, disgusted jerk of his head to his companion. "So be it. We will take this to the capital. We will see what the Alpha King makes of his human warden sheltering a Shadowborn." He turned to leave, then paused at the threshold, his final words dropping like stones into the quiet room. "Burn sage, Miss Thorne. Pray, and hope the darkness within that child does not wake before the king's justice arrives, or you will all be dead long before his verdict." The door slammed shut. The echo seemed to last forever. Alara slumped against the wall, the basket clutched to her, trembling uncontrollably. Kale was crying in earnest now, his marks beginning to flicker with distressed silver light. Leo and the other children crept out, their faces pale. "What do we do, Alara?" Leo asked, his voice small. She looked down at the crying infant, at the harbinger, the abomination. She saw only a scared baby, left alone in a world that wanted him destroyed. She wiped her tears away with a fierce swipe of her hand. "We wait," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "And we prepare. The storm is coming, Leo, and we must be ready to stand in the rain." But deep down, a new chilling fear took root. Torn hadn't just been angry, he had been terrified. What had she truly promised to protect? And when the Alpha King himself looked into these silver eyes, would he see a child, or would he see a monster he needed to destroy? The wait for that answer would be the longest of her life. The days after the guard's visit were taut as a bowstring. Every rustle in the forest was a scout. Every distant howl was a herald of doom. Alara moved through the haven like a ghost, her smiles for the children gentle but strained, her ears constantly tuned to the approach of horses. Kale, unaware of the tempest swirling around his cradle, began to change. At only a few weeks old, his awareness was unnatural. His silver eyes would track a moth across the room with a precision that made Alara's breath catch. He rarely cried. Instead, he would fall into a silent, intense focus, and the air around him would hum, a low, almost musical vibration that made the pottery on the shelves shiver. One afternoon, as a sudden spring squall lashed the windows, Kale grew fussy. Alara rocked him before the fire, singing a lullaby her own mother had sung. As her voice rose, something miraculous happened. The drumming rain on the roof, it softened. The howling wind, it gentled until it was merely a sigh against the eaves. The fire, which had been leaping wildly, settled into a steady, golden blaze. In her arms, Kale relaxed, his flickering silver marks dimming to a soft glow, his eyes drifting shut. Peace. He had summoned peace. Alar's heart swelled with a painful, hopeful ache. This was not the power of a monster. This was the grace of something profound. Leo witnessed it too. His fear of the marked Bobby melted away, replaced by a fierce, protective wonder. He would sit for hours telling Kale stories, and the baby would coo, and the strange black symbols would ripple like water in response. The other children, taking their cue from Leo, began to see Kale not as a cursed thing, but as their strange, quiet little brother. The haven, under the shadow of a death sentence, became a cocoon of fragile, defiant love. A fortnight after Torin's visit, the thunder of hooves finally came. Not the discreet approach of guards, but the earth-shaking rumble of a royal contingent. Alara's time had run out. She dressed Kale in a simple white tunic, the marks on his arms stark and undeniable. "Be brave, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Be who you are." The Alpha King's elite guard were like statues given life, tall, immaculate, their armor etched with the royal crest. They fanned out around the haven, an impenetrable wall of muscle and steel. And then he emerged, Alpha King Lysander Blackwood. He was power incarnate, taller than any man had a right to be, with shoulders that blocked the sun. His hair was the black of a starless midnight, tied back from a face that was all harsh, unforgiving angles and the pale scars of old battles. But it was his eyes that stopped Alara's breath, a blue so deep and intense, like looking into the heart of a glacier, ancient, cold, and capable of grinding mountains to dust. His gaze swept over the haven, over the trembling children huddled behind Alara, and finally it landed on her, on the bundle in her arms. He dismounted with a predator's grace, his black cloak swirling around him. The air grew heavier, charged with the raw alpha authority that rolled off him in waves. Alara fought the instinct to kneel, to lower her eyes. She stood her ground, holding Kale close. "Alara Thorn?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was not a question. "Your Majesty," she managed, dipping her head. "I am told you harbor a creature of prophecy, that you defy my own guard to protect it." He stepped closer, and the sheer presence of him was overwhelming. "Show me." This was it, the moment that would decide if Kale lived or died. With numb fingers, Alara drew back the blanket from Kale's face. The afternoon light fell upon his silver eyes, his marked skin. King Lysander went utterly still, not a muscle moved. The ruthless blue of his eyes widened just a fraction, and in that fraction, Alara saw a flash of something, not horror, but stunned, profound recognition. The silence that followed was thicker than the forest fog, choked with the unsaid. His guards shifted, hands on their weapons, waiting for the order to seize the abomination. Then Lysander did the unthinkable. "Give him to me," he commanded, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. Every protective instinct in Alara screamed no, but the command of a king was absolute. Her arms felt like lead as she transferred the warm, small weight of Kale into the king's large, scarred hands. Lysander caroled him with a surprising care, his warrior's grip adjusting to hold something so fragile. He looked down into the silver eyes, and Kale looked back. He did not cry, he did not fuss, he simply stared up at the formidable king with a serene, unnerving curiosity. Then Kale made a soft sound, a happy gurgle, and reached one tiny marked hand up. His fingers, small and perfect, brushed against the base of Lysander's throat, where the edge of his armor met his skin. The reaction was instantaneous, and it shook the world. Kale's black marks erupted, not a flicker, not a glow, but a blazing torrent of pure liquid silver light that raced across his skin, making the symbols shine like constellations. And from under Lysander's tunic, at the exact spot Kale had touched, an answering light burst forth, a brilliant, matching silver glow that pulsed through the fabric, bright as a captured star. A collective gasp tore from the throats of the guards. Several stumbled back. One fell to a knee. Lysander's face transformed. The glacial calm shattered into an earthquake of emotion, shock, disbelief, a dawning, awe-struck reverence that stripped the king away and left just a man, humbled by a miracle. He looked from the radiant baby in his arms to Alara, his eyes wide and vulnerable. And then Alpha King Lysander Blackwood, the unyielding sovereign who had never bowed to anyone in his life, slowly, deliberately, sank to one knee in the damp earth of the orphanage yard. He knelt, holding the glowing child aloft like the most sacred of offerings, his head bowed not in submission, but in utter, life-altering acknowledgement. The world stopped. "Behold," Lysander's voice rang out, clear and strong, trembling with a fervor no one had ever heard. "The mark of the sovereign heir, the firstborn has returned, and he has chosen." Alara stood frozen, her mind reeling. Sovereign heir? Firstborn? This was not the curse Torin had spoken of. This was something else entirely, something royal, something holy. Lysander rose, the light from his chest and from Kale beginning to fade to a soft, symbiotic pulse. He turned to Alara, and the look in his eyes was one of staggering gratitude. You who they told me was merely a compassionate human, you have sheltered a king. You have protected the living heart of an ancient prophecy." He stepped closer, Kale now sleeping peacefully against his chest, the connection between them a visible, throbbing silver thread of light. "The marks are not a curse, Alara Thorne. They are the royal sigil of the original Alpha line, a line thought lost to time. The silver eyes are the sign of the celestial wolf. This child, Kale, is the direct heir to a power older than my throne. The prophecy said he would reveal himself by choosing his anchor, the one whose spirit would ground his immense power. The glow," he placed a hand over his own chest, "is his choice. He has anchored himself to me." The revelation crashed over Alara in waves, relief so potent it made her dizzy, warred with a new, towering fear. This was bigger than a local superstition. This was about thrones and legacies and forces she could not fathom. "The guards. Torin said he was Shadowborn, a bringer of ruin," she stammered. Lysander's face darkened. "Ignorance, fear. They have twisted the old tales. The firstborn's power is vast, yes. It can shake mountains, but it is not evil. It is pure potential. And without a proper anchor, without guidance," he looked meaningfully at Kale, "such potential could be lost, or worse, twisted by those who would use it." He looked back at Alara, his gaze intense. "He chose me as his anchor, but you, Alara, you were his first protector, his sanctuary. He needs you still. I rule a kingdom. I cannot rock a cradle. Will you come? Will you bring him to the capital and continue to be his guardian, not as a mere caregiver, but as the ward of the sovereign heir, under my direct protection?" It was an offer that upended her life, to leave the haven, the children, her purpose, to step into the glittering, dangerous world of the royal court. She looked at Kale, so small against the king's broad chest. She had promised a dying mother. She had defied armed guards. She had loved a child everyone called a monster. How could she stop now? She met the Alpha King's glacier blue eyes. "The children here, My other children, they will want for nothing. They will have the finest tutors, the safest home here or in the capital, as you wish. This place will become a royal sanctuary, its walls fortified, its purpose honored. His promise was absolute. Alara took a deep, shuddering breath. She thought of the storm calming at Kael's whim. She thought of the glowing bond between king and child. This was her path now, into the storm. Yes, she said, her voice finding its strength. A ghost of a smile, the first she had seen, touched Lysander's stern lips. It transformed him. Then we prepare to depart. The court must see. The kingdom must know. His expression grew grave. But understand, Ilara, not all will welcome this news. Some coveted the throne after me. Some will see Kael not as a miracle, but as a threat to be eliminated. The darkness Torin feared, it does not lie within the child. He looked toward the shadowed tree line, his voice dropping to a whisper. It lies in the hearts of those who will now see him as the ultimate prize, or the final obstacle. The journey to the capital, Argent Keep, was a blur of clattering hooves and breathtaking vistas. Alara spent most of the time in the plush, velvet-lined carriage, Kael a warm, sleeping weight in her arms. Through the window, she watched the rugged borderlands give way to rolling hills, then to the majestic, manicured valleys of the kingdom's heart. Lysander rode alongside, a silent, watchful presence. Sometimes she would catch him looking not at the road, but at the carriage window, his gaze fixed on her, or more often on Kael. The silver glow beneath his tunic was a constant, faint pulse, a living reminder of the impossible bond. Leo and two other orphans, a shy girl named Maya and a boisterous boy named Finn, had chosen to come. Their faces were pressed to the carriage windows, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They were leaving the only home they'd known for a world of stone spires and whispered politics. Argent Keep was not a castle, it was a mountain sculpted into a city. Towers of pale, moon-kissed stone clawed at the sky, woven through with living vines that bloomed with eternal silver flowers. It was beautiful and cold and utterly intimidating. As their procession crossed the soaring bridge into the main gates, a sea of faces stared back. Courtiers in silks and furs, warriors in polished armor, all wearing masks of carefully curated curiosity. The whispers began before the carriage wheels had even stopped. The human warden. Is that the child? I can't see the marks. They say the king knelt, actually knelt. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a specimen under glass. Lysander dismounted and came to the carriage door, offering his hand. It was a public gesture, a statement. She took it, her human hand disappearing in his, and stepped out, holding Kael close. A ripple went through the crowd. The baby, sensing the multitude of eyes, stirred. His own silver eyes opened, and a collective sharp inhale swept through the courtyard, as the black marks on his skin shimmered faintly in the afternoon light. Lysander's voice, amplified by alpha command, cut through the silence. Behold Kael, the sovereign heir, the returned firstborn. By the ancient sigil and the bond of the anchor, he is recognized. He did not smile. He declared. It was law made flesh. They were escorted to quarters that stole Alara's breath. Her rooms were not near the royal chambers. They were royal chambers, a sun-drenched suite adjacent to the king's own, with a nursery that looked like a garden brought indoors. A tall, stern-faced woman named Gwyn, a beta werewolf with kind eyes, was introduced as her attendant. For whatever you or the young prince require, Lysander said, before being swept away by a flock of urgent-looking advisors.
The isolation of luxury was its own kind of cage. Over the next few days, Alara learned the rhythm of the court. It was a dance of subtle glances and poisoned pleasantries.
Nobles came to pay their respects, their eyes hungry, dissecting. They cooed over Kale, but their fingers twitched as if wanting to scrape his marks away. They complimented Alara's unique position, their words dripping with a polite, unshakable condescension. Human, outsider, upstart. The most pointed hostility came from a faction led by Lord Corvin, a hawk-faced alpha with hair the color of tarnished silver and eyes like chips of flint. He was the king's master of laws, a position of immense power, and he made no secret of his skepticism. During an evening reception, Corvin cornered Alara near a towering window overlooking the city. Kale was in her arms, drowsy after a feeding. "A fascinating phenomenon," Corvin said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "The markings are precise, almost artistic. Tell me, Miss Thorne, in your extensive experience with our kind, have you ever encountered a pup whose power manifested as weather manipulation?" Alara stiffened. She had told no one about the calming of the storm. "All children have their quirks, my lord." "Quirks," he smiled, a thin, humorless stretch of lips. "The old texts call it sky-speaking, a dangerous quirk for a child who will, one day, we are told, hold power over armies. Stability is the cornerstone of a kingdom, Miss Thorne, not celestial whimsy." His gaze fell on Kale. "Can you control him when his quirks emerge, or will the anchor," he said the word with a faint sneer, "be required to leash his own heir?" The insult was layered, aimed at her competence, at Kale's nature, and at the king's bond all at once. Before Alara could form a retort, a calm, deep voice spoke from behind Corvin. "The bond of the anchor is not a leash, Corvin. It is a bridge, a tether to this world so his power does not lose him to the stars." Lysander had approached, silent as a shadow. He stood beside Alara, a wall of solid, radiating authority. "Miss Thorne's care provides the foundation. My bond provides the guide rails. He is a child, not a weapon to be controlled. Do you question the prophecy or my judgment?" The air grew thick with alpha pressure. Corvin's neck muscles corded, a subtle sign of strain as he resisted the instinct to lower his eyes. "I question only the practicalities, my king, for the safety of all." He gave a stiff bow and melted back into the crowd. Lysander watched him go, his expression unreadable. He looked down at Kale, who had opened his silver eyes to gaze at him. The faint glow in both their chests brightened for a moment. "The walls here have ears, and the ears have agendas," he said quietly to Alara. "Trust only Gwyn within these rooms. Corvin is not alone. He speaks for those who believe the throne should pass through lines of proven strength, not ancient magic." That night, as a cold spring rain pattered against the crystal windows, Alara sat in the nursery rocking Kale. The fear was a constant companion now, sharper and more sophisticated than the straightforward threat of Torin's sword. Here the danger was in a word, a rumor, a poisoned cup of wine, a tragic accident. Kale fussed, his marks flickering. The rain outside grew heavier, lashing the towers. Alara sang her lullaby, her voice trembling. As she sang, focusing all her love and worry into the melody, Kale's flickering stilled. His eyes closed, and outside the furious storm, it gentled. The lashing rain became a soft, rhythmic patter, a sigh of relief from the sky itself. Alara stopped singing, goosebumps rising on her arms. She looked from the now peaceful baby to the calming storm. Sky speaking. Lord Corvin knew, or he suspected, and if he saw this not as a gift but as a vulnerability, a sign the child's power was tied to his human caregiver's emotions, then her love for Kale wasn't just his comfort, it was his greatest weakness, and her own death warrant. A soft knock came at the nursery door. It was Gwyn holding a tray with a soothing herbal tea. "The little prince is restless on nights like these," she said kindly, but her keen beta eyes missed nothing. She saw Alara's pale face, the peaceful baby, the now quiet night. A knowing, worried look passed between them.
"The storm has passed," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. Gwyn set the tray down. "Some storms are easier to see than others, my lady. The ones outside and the ones brewing within these walls." She gave a slight, meaningful nod towards the door, towards the court beyond. "Sleep when he sleeps. You will need your strength. The true trial has not begun." As Gwyn left, Alara held Kale tighter. She was in a fortress, but she had never felt more exposed. She was guarding a secret that glowed in the dark, in a court where every shadow hid a smile that could cut. Lysander's bond might protect Kale from an open attack, but it could not shield him from the slow, insidious poison of doubt and conspiracy. And she, a human with a lullaby, was the first and weakest line of defense against an enemy she couldn't even name. The ivory tower was not a sanctuary. It was the eye of the coming hurricane. Life in Argent Keep settled into a treacherous kind of normalcy. Mornings were for Kale, his feeding, his bath, his quiet hours of astonishing awareness. Afternoons were a minefield of courtly obligations for Alara. Teas, strolls in the Silver Gardens, listening tours where nobles subtly probed for information. Lysander was a constant, distant pillar of strength. He visited the nursery daily, often in the deep quiet of the evening when the court's chatter had died down. He would hold Kale, and a profound silence would envelop them, one filled not with emptiness, but with the palpable hum of the bond between them. Alara would watch, a strange ache in her chest, part loneliness, part awe. Kale was growing, not just in size, but in the subtle manifestations of his nature. At 3 months old, he didn't just track movement, he seemed to understand intent. When a nervous young maid approached with a tray, her hands shaking, Kale would watch her with his solemn silver gaze until she relaxed. When Lord Corvin entered the room on one pretext or another, Kale would turn his face into Alara's neck, his marks dimming as if in retreat. The baby could sense the wolves in the room, and he knew friend from foe with an instinct deeper than reason. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a rare sunny afternoon. Lysander had come to the solar adjoining the nursery, discussing border security reports with Alara, a gesture of trust that did not go unnoticed by the court. Kale was in the king's arms, playing with the heavy signet ring on his finger, babbling soft, meaningless sounds. The sunlight streamed in, catching the dust motes and the faint, ever-present silver shimmer of the connection between them. Suddenly, Kale went very still. His tiny fingers closed around Lysander's thumb, his silver eyes, usually so calmly observing, fixed on the king's face with an intensity that felt ancient. The black marks on his skin ignited, not with a flash but with a deep, resonant glow that filled the room with soft, pulsing light. Lysander stopped mid-sentence. He looked down, his own chest beginning to shine in answer.
And then Kale spoke. It was not a babble, it was a word, clear as a bell, forged in a tone of pure, powerful resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the room. Athen. The word hung in the air, thrumming with magic. It was Old Tongue, a language of roots and stones. Alara didn't know its meaning, but she saw its effect. Lysander's breath caught in a ragged gasp. The stern, unshakable Alpha King, his eyes glistened instantly with unshed tears. The word echoed, and as it faded, the glowing marks on both of them flared once, brilliantly, before settling back to their gentle pulse. Lysander's arms tightened around Kale, pulling him close, burying his face for a moment in the baby's soft hair. When he looked up at Alara, his expression was raw, stripped bare of all royalty. "He called me Athen," he whispered, his voice thick. "In the old language, it means my foundation, my rock, my father." The word father landed in the room with the weight of a dynasty. Alara's heart swelled even as it twisted. This was a bond she could never be part of in the same way. She was the guardian, the protector, but this was lineage, destiny. Lysander reached out, his free hand grasping Alara's. His grip was firm, warm.
He chose you first, Alara. You are his sanctuary, his heart. This, he said, looking at the child who now cooed contentedly against him, this makes us a family, not by blood, but by a choice far stronger. The look he gave her was no longer just that of a king to his subject. It was a plea, an offering, a shared wonder. In that sun-drenched room, with the word Athen still resonating in the silence, something shifted irrevocably. The professional distance between caretaker and king dissolved. They were two people, bound together by a miraculous child, standing on the precipice of something terrifying and beautiful. But the walls of Argent Keep had ears, and the moment was too powerful, too dangerous to remain secret. The very next evening, during a formal banquet in the Great Hall, the attack came, not with swords, but with words, sharper and more deadly. The hall was a spectacle of wealth and power. Alara sat at the high table, Kale thankfully asleep in the nursery with the trusted Gwyn. Lysander presided, a figure of imposing authority. Lord Corvin stood to give a toast, raising a goblet of blood-red wine. To the health of the king, and to the fascinating new additions to our court. His smile was all teeth. We live in remarkable times, ancient prophecies walking among us, human compassion weaving itself into the very fabric of our royal line. The crowd murmured, a mix of agreement and unease. It makes one consult the older texts, the complete histories. For every light there is a shadow cast. He paused, letting the suspense build. Lysander's fingers tightened on his own goblet. The tales of the firstborn are indeed glorious, but there is another verse, less sung. It speaks of the anchor's burden, that the bond, while granting stability, also creates a vulnerability, a conduit. If the anchor were to be compromised, he said, his eyes flickering to where Alara sat pale and still, the firstborn's immense power could become unmoored, a storm with no eye, a fire with no hearth. He took a sip of his wine. Merely scholarly musings, of course, but in these precarious times, should we not consider all possibilities for the safety of the heir and the kingdom? The threat was exquisitely crafted. He wasn't attacking Kale, he was framing Alara as the risk. Her humanity, her very presence as the primary caregiver was being painted as the weak link in the divine bond. If something happened to Lysander, the implication was clear. The human warden would be blamed for unleashing the child's uncontrollable power. The hall was dead silent. All eyes turned to Alara, the scrutiny now tinged with fresh fear and suspicion. Lysander rose slowly. The alpha aura radiating from him was cold, dense, pressing down on the room. Are you suggesting, Lord Corvin, that my judgment in choosing my court is a danger to this realm, or that the bond of the sovereign heir is so feeble that it can be shattered by malicious gossip? The challenge was direct. Corvin paled but held his ground. I suggest only prudence, my king. The child grows. His power will grow. Should his stability rely on a single fragile point, perhaps a council of guardians, of seasoned alphas, would provide a safer foundation. He was making his move, not to take Kale, but to control him, to surround him with his people, to cut Alara, and by extension Lysander's direct influence, out. Before Lysander could deliver what promised to be a crushing reply, a servant rushed into the hall, his face ashen. He whispered frantically in the ear of the captain of the guard, who immediately strode to the king. The captain's voice was low, but in the tense silence it carried. Your Majesty, the royal nursery, there's been an incident. Alara's world tilted. She was on her feet before she knew it, her chair scraping loudly. Lysander was already moving, a black-clad force of nature cutting through the crowd.
Alara ran after him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, Corvin's poisonous words forgotten in the wake of a much more tangible terror. They stormed into the nursery suite. The scene was one of ordered chaos. Gwyn stood in the center of the room, clutching a trembling hand to her chest, her beta fangs extended in a snarl. 2 royal guards were examining the window, a large leaded glass pane that now had a single, perfectly round hole in its center, like a bullet hole. On the floor beneath it, nestled in the plush rug, was a small, black-fletched arrow. It hadn't been shot, it was placed, a message. And pinned to the arrow's shaft was a scrap of parchment. On it, in elegant, spidery script, were 5 words. The foundation can be cracked. The nursery, once a sanctuary of soft light and lullabies, now was a crime scene. The air hung thick with the scent of cold night, fear, and Gwyn's barely contained rage. Alara rushed past the guards to the ornate crib. Kale lay there, swaddled in silver silk, sleeping peacefully, unharmed. A sob of relief choked her, and she leaned over the rail, her fingers gently checking his warm brow, his steady breath. His marks were calm, a soft, sleeping silver. Lysander stood by the window, the black arrow held in his hand like a venomous serpent. His face was a mask of glacial fury, but his eyes, when they met Alara's, held a terror she had never seen in him before. It was the fear of a king who had just glimpsed how fragile his most precious treasure was. "Report," he commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Gwyn stepped forward, her usual composure fractured. "I was humming to him, Your Majesty. The fire was lit. I heard a tap, like a pebble on glass. I turned, and it was there. Your Majesty, it was already lodged in the wood of the window frame. The hole was made. They didn't shoot it through. They placed it through the hole they'd already created. A silent precision breach." Her voice shook with shame. "I failed. I did not hear them approach. I did not sense them."
"You are a beta, Gwyn," Lysander said, not unkindly. "If you did not sense them, they were cloaked, or they were not wolves." He examined the arrowhead. Not metal, but a sharpened, blackened thorn from the deadly sorrowwood trees that grew in the northern wastes. Untraceable. The fletching was raven feather, common as dirt. The message was the only unique thing. The foundation can be cracked. Alara read the words over his shoulder, a cold dread seeping into her marrow. "Ethan," she whispered, "they're talking about you, the bond." Lysander's jaw clenched. "They are declaring war on the prophecy itself. They know they cannot touch him directly. The bond would scream, I would know. So they target the concept of it. They seek to prove it is vulnerable, to sow doubt." He crumpled the parchment in his fist. This was not an assassination attempt. It was a demonstration. They got within 100 paces of the heir's crib to deliver a taunt. My guards, my walls, my bond, all rendered meaningless. The implication was a devastation more complete than any open attack. The nursery was the most heavily guarded room in Argent Keep, save the king's own. If an enemy could penetrate this far, then nowhere was safe. And the message was a psychological dagger aimed at the heart of Lysander's newfound fatherhood. You are not strong enough to protect what you have claimed. The next hours were a blur of grim activity. The guard rotation was tripled, windows were reinforced with crystal-treated crystal, scouts were dispatched to scour the grounds and the city below. But the perpetrator, like a ghost, had left no scent, no track, no whisper. In the dead of night, long after the commotion had died to a tense watchfulness, Alara found she could not sleep. She paced the solar, the crumpled note, now smoothed on the table, burning in her mind. Lysander was there, staring into the dying fire, a shadow of himself. "They're right, you know," he said quietly, not turning. "The bond, it is a tether to me, my strength, my stability.
But what if my strength falters? What if in protecting the kingdom I am wounded, weakened? He finally looked at her, his blue eyes haunted. Kael's power is rooted in that connection. If I am the cracked foundation, what happens to him? Alara stopped her pacing. She saw not the mighty Alpha King, but a man terrified for his child. The fear she had seen earlier was now naked in the firelight. She walked over and stood before him. "Then you don't stand alone," she said, her voice firm. "You are his Aethan, but I am his Alara, his first protector, the one who sings the storms to sleep. The bond is between you two, but his heart, that is with both of us. If the foundation is attacked, we reinforce it, together." Her words hung between them, a vow. Lysander searched her face, and the raw vulnerability in his gaze slowly hardened back into resolution, but a new kind, a shared resolve. He nodded once, a deep, acknowledging gesture. "Corvin," he stated, the name a curse. "He left the banquet just before the alarm was raised," Alara recalled. "He made the threat publicly, then the arrow appeared. It's too obvious." "Exactly," Lysander said, a sharp, calculating edge returning to his voice. "It is obvious. Corvin is many things, ambitious, ruthless, but he is not a fool. This reeks of a frame. Someone wants me to move against Corvin, to purge a faction and create chaos in the court. Or," he paused, "they want me to dismiss him as a suspect, leaving the true threat hidden." The plot had just deepened from a single shadow to a hall of mirrors. So what do? We do nothing and everything. Lysander stood, his kingly mantle settling back onto his shoulders. Publicly, we increase security. We express outrage. We let the court whisper. We watch. The arrow was a test of our defenses and our nerves. We must not fail the next one. He turned to leave, then stopped. "From tomorrow, you and Kael do not leave these chambers without me or a guard I have personally touched. Lessons will be brought here. Air will be taken on the highest, most secure balcony. Trust no one new." His eyes softened a fraction. "And Alara, thank you for reminding me that a foundation is strongest when it is built on more than one pillar." After he left, Alara returned to the nursery. She looked down at Kael, his silver eyelashes fanned on his cheeks. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. They were inside the walls, speaking the language of court and poison. They knew about the bond. They knew the ancient word Aethan. This was an enemy with knowledge, with patience, with a plan that was only just beginning to unfold. She knelt by the crib, a new determination crystallizing within her. They thought her just the human caregiver, the fragile link. They thought her powerless. But she had a power they had not accounted for, a mother's love and a protector's ferocity. Let them come with their arrows and their riddles. Let them try to crack the foundation. She would be the unbreakable shield around them both, and she would find the hand that drew that bow, even if she had to walk through every shadow in Argent Keep to do it. The game had begun, and Alara Thorne, the orphanage keeper, was ready to play. The weeks that followed the arrow were a lesson of gilded siege warfare. Alara's world shrank to the royal suite, a beautiful, tense cage. Kael grew stronger, his silver eyes missing nothing. He was a happy baby, gurgling with laughter for Leo, who now served as his unofficial older brother and most dedicated jester. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, Kael would stare at the newly reinforced window, his tiny brow furrowed, as if sensing the threat that had seeped through the glass. Lysander was a storm contained. He ruled with a cold, meticulous efficiency, but the easy moments from before the arrow were gone. His visits were shorter, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing. The bond between him and Kael thrummed with a low, protective frequency that Alara could almost feel. He had trusted guards, alphas he had fought beside, personally scent-marked the doors and windows, a primal warning to any other wolf. But the true battle was in the courtly theater below. Alara was not entirely isolated. Nobles still came to pay their respects under the watchful eyes of the king's guards. The arrow had changed the script. Lord Corvin's faction now wore an air of smug vindication. Their whispers were no longer subtle. "I heard the nursemaid was distracted," one countess murmured too loudly during a stilted tea in Alara's receiving room. "Human senses, you know, so dull. A wolf would have smelled the intruder a league away." Another lord, a sycophant of Corvin's, nodded sagely. "A fragile guardian for such a volatile treasure. The king's bond is strength, yes, but it is anchored to his will. If his attention is divided by lesser concerns." He let the sentence hang, his eyes sweeping dismissively over Alara. The attack was always the same. Question her competence, her species, her very right to be there. Frame her as the vulnerability. Alara learned to school her face into a mask of placid courtesy, but inside she seethed. She was not a nursemaid. She was a warden who had defended her charge with nothing but her will against armed guards. They had no idea of her mettle. The breaking point came during the Moon Festival, a celebration of the first full moon of summer. It was the first major court event since Kale's arrival, and Lysander decreed the heir would make a brief appearance, a show of strength, of normalcy. Alara's stomach was a knot of dread as Gwen dressed Kale in a tiny tunic of moon-white silk, his marks like dark vines against the fabric. The great hall was transformed, shimmering with bioluminescent fungi and silver lanterns. The air buzzed with music and tension. When Lysander entered with Alara beside him, holding Kale, a forced silence fell, followed by a wave of murmured awe and thinly veiled anxiety. They took their place on the dais. Kale, overwhelmed by the lights and sounds, began to fuss, his marks flickering nervously. It was then that Lord Corvin approached, a goblet in hand, a smile on his thin lips. "A blessed night, and look, the young prince honors the moon with his own light." His voice was jovial, carrying. He reached out as if to chuck Kale under the chin, a bold, familiar gesture. Alara instinctively shifted Kale away, a subtle movement. Corvin's hand hung in the air. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes turned flinty. "So protective, Miss Thorne. One might think you distrust the king's own court." "It is a loud night, my lord. He is overstimulated." Alara's voice was steady despite her pounding heart. Of course," Corvin said, withdrawing his hand. He took a sip of his wine, his gaze speculative. "Stimulation, such a human concept for a wolf's spirit. Perhaps what he needs is not less sensation, but the right kind. The feel of pack earth, the sound of true howls, not just courtly melodies." He turned his attention to Lysander. "Your Majesty, the traditional pup howl is performed tonight. Might it not be beneficial for the heir to witness it, to feel the primal connection in his blood?" The pup howl was a harmless ritual. The youngest members of noble families gathered to howl at the moon, but it was outside, in the less secure inner courtyard. It was a trap, wrapped in tradition. Lysander's expression was unreadable. "The heir is too young for rituals, Corvin." "With respect, sire, is he? His power is ancient. Should his education not begin early? Sheltering him might limit his potential, make him stranger to his own nature." Corvin's words were a masterstroke, playing on every fear in the room, that Kale was too different, too removed, too human-influenced. Alara felt the court's eyes on her, judging, blaming. She was the shelter, she was the limit. Kale's fussing grew louder, his silver glow pulsing erratically. The lanterns near the dais flickered in response. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "See," the silent accusation screamed, "he is unstable." Lysander's jaw was rigid. The pressure to comply, to prove Kale was a normal wolf pup, was immense. Refusing would look like fear, like confirmation of weakness. Then Alara did something reckless. She leaned close to Kale, turning him away from the crowd, and began to sing. Not a loud song, but the same simple lullaby from the night of the storm. Her voice was soft, a thread of warmth in the cold, judging hall.
She poured into it all her love, all her defiance, all her certainty that he was just a scared baby. A miracle unfolded. Cale's cries hiccuped, his glowing marks steadied, then softened to their gentle, sleeping rhythm. The lanterns calmed. He nestled into her shoulder with a sigh, his eyes drifting shut. The connection hadn't been to the moon, or to the pack, it had been to her. Her human song had soothed the celestial air. The silence this time was stunned, reverent. Alara lifted her head, meeting Corvin's shocked gaze. Her own eyes were hard. "It seems, my lord, he simply needed a reminder of home. Not every wolf finds his pack in a howl. Some find it in a heartbeat." The rebuke was elegant and devastating. She had not just calmed the child, she had demonstrated a bond that transcended wolfish ritual, one that Corvin could neither understand nor break. Lysander looked at her, a spark of fierce pride in his glacial eyes. Corvin recovered with a stiff bow, a touching display. He retreated, his plan in ashes. But the victory was double-edged. As Alara stood there, holding the now sleeping child, she realized the true cost. She had publicly cemented her role as Cale's essential comfort, his emotional anchor. She had proven her power over him. In the eyes of a hidden enemy who wanted control, that made her no longer just a nuisance. It made her a target that needed to be removed. The cracks in the court weren't just in the foundation Lysander provided. They were aiming to shatter the very hands that held the heir, and tonight she had held those hands up for all to see. The siege of whispers was over. The next attack, she knew with cold certainty, would be far less subtle. The triumph of the Moon Festival was short-lived, bitter ash on the tongue. In the days that followed, Alara felt the change in the air of Argent Keep, a sharpening, a focusing of the hostility that had once been a diffuse cloud. She was no longer just the human upstart, she was the proven linchpin, the one whose song could quiet the storm in the sovereign air. To Lysander's allies, this was a comfort. To his enemies, it was a glaring vulnerability, a problem with a clear solution. Cale, now 5 months old, was a sunbeam in the gathering gloom. He could sit up, his silver eyes missing nothing. He had developed a delighted, gummy smile for Lysander, whose visits were the highlights of his small world. The bond between them was a visible, tender thing. When Lysander entered the room, Cale's marks would brighten with a soft, joyful pulse, and the answering glow from the king's chest seemed to ease the perpetual tension from his shoulders. They were learning each other, the mighty king learning the gentleness of fatherhood, the miraculous child learning the security of a father's love. Alara cherished these moments, but a thorn of loneliness pricked her heart. She was the bridge between these two extraordinary males, but where did she stand? The king's gratitude was profound, but it was a walled garden she could not enter. Her life was Cale, and Cale's life was now inextricably woven with the fate of a kingdom. She felt adrift. Her only solace, aside from Cale, was teaching Leo, Maya, and Finn. She turned the solar into a makeshift schoolroom, lessons on history and ethics mixed with her own hard-won wisdom about compassion and courage. Leo especially drank it in, his protective instinct for Cale blossoming into a fierce desire to be worthy of the royal court that still looked down on him. One afternoon, as a real storm gathered over the mountains, turning the sky the color of bruised steel, a new face appeared in her chambers. Lady Seraphine, a cousin to the king from a distant, respected pack, arrived with an escort. She was ethereally beautiful, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes of cool, clear gray. She moved with a wolf's grace, but her smile was warm, her demeanor gentle. "Miss Thorne," she said, her voice a melodious chime, "forgive the intrusion. I have heard so much of your devotion to our precious heir. I wished to pay my respects and to offer my services. I am a skilled weaver of calming herbs, teas for restless pups, sachets for peaceful sleep. With your permission, I would like to blend something for the young prince. The court can be overstimulating."
Her offer was gracious, practical. Unlike the other nobles, she didn't condescend. She spoke of Cale with genuine warmth. Gwyn, standing watchfully by the door, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Wary, but disarmed, Alara agreed. Over the next week, Lady Seraphine became a regular, welcome presence. She brought delicate teas that did seem to soothe Kale. She spoke kindly to the orphaned children. She listened to Alara's concerns about the court with a sympathetic ear. She was, Alara began to believe, an ally, a fragment of the pack sense Kale deserved. She even coaxed a laugh from Lysander on one of his visits, a rare, beautiful sound that made Alara's heart do a strange, painful flip. The storm outside broke on the 7th day. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the crystal windows. It was time for Kale's evening audience with Lysander, a new ritual where the king would hold him and simply be. But the storm agitated the baby. As Alara carried him toward the king's study, Kale began to whimper, his marks flickering like distant lightning. The lanterns in the hallway dimmed and surged. "Shh, little wolf," Alara murmured, quickening her pace. "It's only thunder." She entered the study. Lysander was at his great oak desk, maps and reports spread before him. The room was lit by a roaring fire, but the thunder was louder here, vibrating in the stone. Kale's distress escalated into full, panicked cries. His silver glow became blinding, lashing out like electrical arcs. The fire in the hearth roared upward, threatening the mantel. The maps on the desk rustled violently, as if in a gale. The very air crackled. "Alara!" Lysander was on his feet, his own chest blazing in response, not with calm, but with shared, amplified alarm. The bond was feeding the panic, looping it between them. "Calm him!" Alara tried to sing, but her voice was swallowed by the cacophony. She rocked him, but his little body was rigid with terror. This was different. This was his power, raw and unchecked, reacting to the fury of the natural world and magnified by his anchor's own spike of fear. The window panes rattled in their frames. A vase shattered. And then Lady Seraphine was there. She must have followed them. She moved past Alara with a serene confidence. She did not reach for Kale. Instead, she went to the hearth and threw a handful of glittering powder from a pouch at her belt into the flames. They died instantly to embers, plunging the room into near darkness, save for Kale's wild, silver light. Then she began to hum. Not a lullaby, but a low, resonant, primal tone, the sound of the earth itself, deep and steadying. She locked her gray eyes on Kale. "Little king," she crooned, her voice weaving through his cries. "The sky rages, but the mountain stands. Be the mountain." Something in her tone, in that ancient hum, pierced through Kale's panic. His wails hitched. He turned his glowing eyes toward her. Seraphine held his gaze, her own calm and unshakable fortress. Slowly, so slowly, the lashing silver light retracted. The howling wind in the room died. Kale's rigid body went limp, exhausted, his marks fading to a faint shimmer. He let out a shuddering sigh and buried his face in Alara's neck. The silence was deafening, broken only by the now distant rumble of thunder outside. Lysander let out a long, ragged breath, the light in his chest dimming. He looked at Seraphine with immense gratitude. "Your gift, it is beyond price, cousin. You reached him when we could not." Seraphine bowed her head modestly. "It is an old talent, your majesty. The firstborn's power is tied to the elements. It requires a certain elemental touch to guide it when it overwhelms him." She gave Alara a gentle, pitying smile. "Do not blame yourself, Miss Thorne. Your love is his home, but his power, that is a wild thing of wind and stone. It needs a wolf spirit to fully understand it." The message was clear, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. Alara's human love was a comfort, but it was insufficient. It was a wolf, a royal wolf with ancient knowledge who had truly saved the day, who had calmed the storm inside the child when his own anchor and human guardian had failed. Lysander was nodding, impressed. "You will stay close, Seraphine. Your assistance is hereby formally requested." "It would be my honor, Athen," she said, using the sacred title with a respectful dip of her head, and the intimacy of it, her using Kale's word for him, stung Alara like a whip.
As Seraphine glided from the room, leaving behind the scent of cold stone and herbs, Alara stood holding the sleeping Kale. The victory she'd felt at the festival curdled into a cold, hard dread. She had been outmaneuvered. The enemy wasn't always a sneering lord like Corvin. Sometimes it was a beautiful, helpful cousin with a soothing hum and a pouch of magic powder. Someone who could do what Alara could not and make it look easy. Someone who could subtly, kindly, make Alara seem exactly what the court whispered she was, a temporary, fragile substitute for what Kale truly needed. The storm outside was passing, but inside Alara Thorne, a colder, more dangerous tempest was just beginning to brew. Lady Seraphine's integration into our lives was as seamless as it was suffocating. With the king's official sanction, she took up residence in a suite near the royal chambers. Her elemental touch became a daily presence. She prepared Kale's baths with crushed moon-blessed herbs that made his silver marks gleam. She hummed her grounding tones when he showed the first flickers of restlessness, often preempting any distress. She was always there, a serene, competent shadow, her gray eyes missing nothing. Alara felt herself being gently, inexorably sidelined. Her tasks, the feeding, the rocking, the basic care, remained, but they felt diminished. The profound, wordless understanding she'd shared with Kale now had a translator. "He is feeling the pressure drop in the air," Seraphine would say as Kale fussed. "The earth is shifting deep below the castle." Her explanations were mystical, authoritative, and utterly alien to Alara's human experience. They made Kale's needs seem part of a grand, cosmic system that only a wolf of ancient lineage could navigate. Worst of all was the effect on Lysander. The king, burdened by the weight of rulership and the constant gnawing fear for Kale's safety, clung to Seraphine's expertise like a lifeline. He consulted her on everything from the security of the nursery to the selection of Kale's future tutors. Her opinions carried weight. When Alara suggested a simple walk in the walled inner garden, Seraphine would gently counter. "The western quadrant, perhaps. The geomagnetic lines are more stable there. It will be less disruptive for his nascent senses." Lysander would agree, every time. Ilara's practical human wisdom was being overwritten by a language of magic and legacy she could not speak. The loneliness became a physical ache. She confided in Leo one evening as they watched Kale practice sitting up, Seraphine hovering nearby with a crystal to channel harmonious energies. "She's taking him from you," Leo muttered, his young face grim with an understanding beyond his years. "Not all at once, but piece by piece." "She's helping him," Ilara replied, the words tasting like ash. "She understands his power in a way I never can." "You understand him," Leo insisted fiercely. "You knew he was just a baby when everyone else saw a monster. That's worth more than all her crystals and hums."
But was it? The incident in the study haunted her. She had failed. Seraphine had succeeded. The proof was in the relieved look in Lysander's eyes every time his cousin worked her quiet magic. The breaking point came during a state council. Alara was invited to attend as Kale's guardian. He sat in her lap, playing with a polished stone, mercifully calm. The council was debating the increasing unrest in the northern territories, skirmishes with rogue shifters, strange blights on the land. Lord Corvin, of course, saw a connection. "The natural order is fraying," he intoned, casting a meaningful glance at Kale. "Old powers awaken and the world grows unstable in response. Our focus must be on securing the source of this awakening, ensuring its alignment with the kingdom's stability." His meaning was clear: control Kale, control the chaos. Lysander argued for diplomacy, for strength through unity, but the worry on the faces of the other council members was plain. They were afraid of the northern blight, and they were afraid of the silver-eyed child in their midst. Then Seraphine, who attended as a royal advisor on mystical matters, spoke. Her voice was a soothing balm in the tense room.
The firstborn's power is not the cause of the unrest, but the key to its resolution. He is a harmonizer, but to harmonize a disharmonious world, his own instrument must be perfectly tuned. His anchor, she bowed respectfully to Lysander, provides the fundamental note, but the melody, the complex interplay with the elements, that requires a dedicated guide, one attuned to the subtle frequencies he emits. She was proposing a formal role for herself, Cale's mystical tutor and regulator. She was building a case, brick by logical brick, that Ilara's care was merely custodial, while the true shaping of the sovereign heir's world-altering power required specialized wolfish knowledge, her knowledge. As the council murmured in agreement, a terrible, heavy pressure began to build in the room. Not from the debate, but from Cale. He had gone still in Ilara's lap. His silver eyes were wide, fixed on the arguing adults, on Corvin's sharp face, on Seraphine's calm one. He could feel the tension, the fear, the ambition swirling around him like a toxic fog. His small body began to tremble. The black marks on his skin ignited, not with their usual gentle glow, but with a frantic, stuttering light. The polished stone in his hand grew warm, then hot. Ilara gasped as it seared her thigh through her dress. "Cale?" she whispered, trying to turn him away, to block out the stressful energy. But it was too late. The bond with Lysander, stressed by the king's own rising frustration and worry, acted as an amplifier. Cale's fear spiked, and his power lashed out, not as a storm, but as a wave of pure, crushing heaviness. It was as if the gravity in the room tripled. Council members grunted, slumping in their chairs. Scrolls and goblets clattered to the floor. The very air became thick, difficult to breathe. Lysander staggered, clutching the table, the glow in his chest a painful, blinding white. He was trying to absorb it, to anchor it, but the feedback loop was too strong. "Seraphine," he gritted out. But Seraphine was also affected, her face pale with strain. Her grounding hum died in her throat. She reached for her herbs, but her movements were slow, laborious. It was Ilara who acted. Forgetting the politics, forgetting her feelings of inadequacy, she saw only her child in terror. She stood up, the increased gravity making the simple act a Herculean effort. She stumbled to the great window, away from the oppressive focus of the council. She pressed Cale's face against her shoulder, blocking his view, and she did the only thing she knew to do. She began to talk. Not sing, just talk. Her voice was low, labored, but utterly normal, a human voice in a room buckling under magical force. "It's all right, my heart. It's just noisy people. Remember the garden? Remember the fat bumblebee on the silver flower? It buzzed so loudly, but it was just going about its day making honey. This is just noise, Cale, just buzzing." She spoke of simple things, of the taste of apple porridge, of the feel of warm sunlight, of Leo's terrible jokes. She created a bubble of mundane human reality around them with her words. She was not fighting his power, she was ignoring it. She was reminding him of a world that was small and safe and hers. Slowly, so slowly, the terrible pressure began to ease. Cale's trembling subsided, his frantic glow softened, then dimmed to his usual sleep-like pulse. The gravity in the room normalized with a final shuddering sigh. Council members gasped for breath, staring in shock. Cale lifted his head, his silver eyes bleary with spent emotion. He looked at Ilara, touched her cheek with a tiny, still warm hand, and uttered a single, clear, exhausted syllable. "Ma." The word echoed in the silent, ravaged council chamber. It was not the ancient prophetic Othin, it was a simpler, more universal truth. Ma, a child's first name for the source of all comfort. Ilara's tears fell freely then, dripping on his marked skin. She held him close, rocking gently. Lysander was staring at them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of stunned revelation. He had seen his bond falter under the strain. He had seen Seraphine's magic fail. He had seen Ilara, with no power but her love and her words, pull his son back from the brink by reminding him of what it was to simply be a child. The crisis had passed, but in its wake the fragile alliance in the nursery had shattered. Ilara had proven her indispensability in a way no one could deny, least of all the king, and she had also made herself and the profound, simple love Cale had named Ma the single biggest obstacle to anyone who wanted to control the heir by his power alone. The bullseye on her back had just been painted in the brightest, most undeniable colors. The council chamber incident became a quiet legend, spoken of in hushed tones. The king's human ward had done what mystical herbs and alpha bonds could not. She had spoken a storm to sleep. The word Ma clung to Ilara like a new title, one more intimate and powerful than any lady or warden. It was a claim Cale had staked on her heart, and the entire court heard it.
Lysander's behavior shifted. His gratitude was no longer just polite, it was fervent, almost reverent. He sought her counsel on matters beyond Cale's care, on the morale of the people, on the treatment of human refugees at the border. He began to see her not as a puzzle, but as a missing piece. His visits to the nursery grew longer, less formal. He would stay after Cale was asleep, talking with Ilara by the fire about his fears for the kingdom, his hopes for his son, the crushing loneliness of the throne. The glacial blue of his eyes would thaw in the firelight, revealing the weary, idealistic man beneath the crown. Ilara, in turn, saw past the king to Lysander. She saw the weight he carried, the scars of old battles not just on his skin but on his soul. She saw the fierce, protective love he had for Cale, a love that mirrored her own. A dangerous, fragile warmth began to grow between them, a shared understanding that felt like the only real thing in the Palace of Illusions. This new closeness did not go unnoticed. Lady Seraphine's serene mask developed the faintest of hairline cracks. Her smiles toward Ilara grew tighter, her helpful suggestions carried a sharper edge. She redoubled her efforts with Cale, her elemental sessions becoming more frequent, more intense. She brought rare crystals that pulsed in time with his marks, claiming they would align his frequencies. She began speaking to him in the same ancient tongue from which Athen had come, words that made Lysander nod in approval, but left Ilara feeling locked out. One afternoon, Seraphine proposed a new ritual, a moon-bathing ceremony on the highest, most isolated tower of Argent Keep. The full moon is when his celestial connection is strongest, she explained to Lysander, her gray eyes luminous with conviction. To bathe in its light, away from the dampening stones of the lower levels, will strengthen his core power. It is written in the oldest texts concerning the firstborn. Lysander, ever eager to do what was best for Cale's development, agreed. Ilara's protests about the cold, the exposure, the security risk of such an isolated location were gently overruled. Seraphine will be there. My most trusted guards will be on the stairs. It is for his good, Ilara, Lysander said, his hand briefly touching hers, a gesture meant to reassure, but which felt like a dismissal. The night of the full moon was achingly clear and cold. The tower pinnacle was a circle of pale stone open to the sky, the world falling away into silvery darkness on all sides. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like an altar. Seraphine had prepared the space with intricate chalk circles and smoldering braziers of incense that smelled of ice and metal. Cale, bundled in furs, was placed in the center of the largest circle. The moonlight fell directly upon him, and his silver eyes and marks seemed to drink it in, glowing with an ethereal, cool light. Seraphine began to chant, her voice rising and falling in that ancient tongue. She moved around him, sprinkling more of her glittering powder. Cale was quiet, watchful, but Ilara didn't like the look in his eyes, a distant, hollow look, as if he were receding somewhere deep inside. His spirit is reaching for the constellations, Seraphine whispered triumphantly to Lysander, who watched with rapt attention. He is communing. But Ilara saw a child growing cold and detached. She stepped forward, unable to bear it. His shivering, it's enough. Do not break the connection, Seraphine hissed, a flash of genuine anger breaking through her calm. This is delicate work. It was then that Leo, who had insisted on coming, tugged on Ilara's sleeve.
He pointed subtly to the edge of the tower, where the shadows of the crenellations lay thick. "I saw something move," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not a guard. Lower, like something crawling." A bolt of pure alarm shot through Alara. She followed his gaze. For a moment, nothing. Then, a patch of shadow detached itself from the rest and flowed, silent and liquid, over the stone. It resolved into a low, sleek form, a wolf, but unlike any she'd seen. Its fur was the color of tarnished shadow, and its eyes reflected no light. It moved with an unnerving, boneless grace, making not for the guards at the stairwell, but directly for the chanting Seraphine and the entranced Kale. Alara didn't think. She screamed, "Lysander!" and threw herself between the shadow creature and the circle. Chaos erupted. The creature let out a silent snarl and leapt. Lysander's roar of fury shook the stones as he shifted mid-stride, his massive black wolf form intercepting the assassin in a clash of fangs and shadow. Guards surged forward. But the attack was a feint. As Lysander battled the shadow wolf, a second, identical creature melted from the shadows on the opposite side of the tower. It had used the distraction. Its target was clear. Kale. Seraphine screamed, fumbling for a pouch at her belt, but she was too slow. Her ritual focus shattered. Alara was already moving. She scooped Kale from the circle, the furs falling away. The moment her hands touched him, breaking the ritual's geometric hold, his distant eyes snapped into focus, terrified focus. His marks blazed, not with moon-fed serenity, but with panic. The shadow wolf was upon them. Alara turned her back, curling her body around Kale, a human shield against a magical assassin. She braced for the impact, for tearing fangs. It never came. A wave of force erupted from Kale, a silent, expanding sphere of pure silver energy. It passed through Alara harmlessly, a warm rush of power, but it hit the shadow wolf like a physical wall. The creature disintegrated, not into gore, but into dissipating smoke and a fading shrill shriek. The energy sphere washed over the entire tower, the braziers snuffed out, the chalk circles smeared into nothingness. Lysander, having just torn the throat from the first assassin, was knocked back to his human form, skidding across the stone. The guards froze, stunned. In the sudden, ringing silence, Kale wailed, a raw, frightened sound, and buried his face in Alara's neck, his glowing marks casting her face in silver relief. She held him, shaking, her own breath coming in ragged gasps. Lysander staggered to his feet, naked, bleeding from claw marks, his eyes wild. He looked from the dissipating shadow smoke to Alara holding his son, and the reality of the trap crashed down on him. The ritual, the isolation, the perfectly timed, coordinated attack that bypassed his guards. It hadn't just been an assassination attempt, it had been a staging, and they had walked right into it. His gaze, burning with fury and a dawning terrible understanding, snapped to Seraphine. She stood amidst the ruins of her own making. The mask of serenity was gone, replaced by the poised stillness of a player whose gambit had been unexpectedly overturned. The attack had failed to kill Kale, but it had succeeded in exposing something far more dangerous lurking within the castle walls. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. She was standing 10 feet away, smelling of ice and metal, with moonlight glinting in her cold, gray eyes. The tower pinnacle became a frozen tableau of accusation and shock. The chilling wind whipped around them, carrying away the last traces of shadow, smoke, and incense. Lysander, heedless of his nakedness and the blood trickling down his chest, stood like an avenging statue, his blue eyes locked on Seraphine. The bond mark on his chest pulsed with a furious, wounded light. Seraphine did not crumble. She drew herself up, the picture of affronted dignity. "Lysander, Athen," she said, emphasizing the sacred title, "you cannot believe I had any part in this atrocity. I am of your blood. I have dedicated myself to the heir's well-being." "You dedicated yourself to placing him on an open altar under a full moon, miles from any real protection, citing texts you provided."
Lysander's voice was a lash. "My guards were neutralized by creatures that moved like shadows, creatures no wolf sensed until it was too late. How is that possible, Seraphine? What magic cloaks so perfectly?" Elara, clutching the sobbing Kale to her chest, felt a cold clarity wash over her. The pieces, once scattered and confusing, snapped together with a dreadful click. Seraphine's timely arrival, her specific esoteric knowledge that always made Elara seem inadequate, her insistence on rituals that isolated Kale, that tested his power, that required her unique presence. She hadn't just been sidelining Elara, she had been studying Kale, probing his defenses, mapping the limits of his power and his bond with the king. The council incident, the tower attack, they weren't setbacks for her, they were data. "You wanted to see what would happen," Elara said, her voice cutting through the wind. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of certainty. At the council, when his power spiked, you weren't scared, you were observing. You saw the bond could be stressed. You saw my ma could pull him back. Tonight, you wanted to see if, in a state of heightened communion, he could be taken, or if his power, when threatened, would manifest defensively. You were experimenting on a baby. Seraphine's gray eyes flicked to Elara, and for a fraction of a second, the mask of the gentle cousin vanished, revealing a glint of cold, intellectual hunger. It was gone in an instant, replaced by wounded virtue. "This human's fear has poisoned your mind, my king. I have only ever sought to—" "Seize her," Lysander commanded, his voice leaving no room for debate. Two of his elite guards moved forward. Seraphine did not resist. She held her head high as they took her arms. But as they led her toward the stairs, she looked back over her shoulder, not at Lysander, but at Kale. Her gaze was not one of hatred, but of intense, covetous fascination. "You have no idea what he is, what he could be. You keep a star in a nursery and call it parenting." Then she was gone, escorted down into the bowels of the keep. The aftermath was a whirlwind of grim activity. Kale, exhausted by terror and the explosive use of his power, fell into a deep, troubled sleep. Elara refused to let him go, rocking him in her chambers as healers tended to Lysander's wounds, right there in her solar. The claw marks were deep, but not venomous. The true injury was to his trust. "She is of the Moonfall Pack," Lysander growled as a healer stitched his skin. "A reclusive branch, keepers of arcane lore. They were always intense in their studies. I thought her detachment was scholarly. I was a fool." "She wasn't working alone," Elara said, still rocking. "Those shadow creatures weren't wolves. They weren't any natural thing, and someone had to coordinate that attack, to know the guard rotation on the tower." Lysander nodded, his face grim. "Corvin, he has been silent since the council, too silent. He and Seraphine, their goals align. He wants control through political means. She wants control through understanding. They would make formidable allies." He winced as the needle pulled through his skin. "The interrogation will begin at dawn. We will unwind this web, thread by bloody thread." But the web struck first. Just before dawn, as the sky lightened to a pale, sickly gray, a guardsman burst into the solar, his face ashen. "Your Majesty, the dungeon, Lady Seraphine." They found her cell not empty, but occupied by a corpse that was not her own. It was one of the junior guards, a young beta, his throat slit with surgical precision. On the wall, written in his blood, was a single, stark sentence in the ancient tongue. Lysander translated it, his voice hollow with rage. "The foundation is flawed. The star will be claimed." Seraphine was gone, vanished from a locked, magically warded cell, leaving behind a dead pawn and a message that was both a boast and a promise. She had help from within the very heart of his security. The crack in his foundation, she was saying, was not just the bond, but the corruption within his own house. Lysander's roar of fury shook the dungeon stones. He gave orders, lockdowns, interrogations of every guard, every servant who had access. But the mood in Argent Keep shifted from wary to openly terrified. If a royal cousin and a dungeon guard could be turned, who was next? The enemy wasn't at the gates. They were in the walls, breathing the same air.
Returning to the nursery suite, the dawn light felt like an indictment. Ilara sat with Kale, who slept on, unaware of the fresh turmoil. Leo, Maya, and Finn huddled together, their eyes huge. The fragile sense of safety they had begun to build was utterly shattered. Lysander stood before the window, staring out at his mist-shrouded kingdom. His broad shoulders were slumped, not from weariness, but from the weight of betrayal. "I have fought wars with armies against armies," he said quietly to no one and everyone. "I have faced challenges to my rule in open combat, but this poison in the dark, using my own kin, my own people, this is a battle I do not know how to fight." Ilara rose and went to him. She didn't touch him, but stood beside him, looking out at the same view. "You fight it by being what they are not," she said. "They see a star to be claimed, a foundation to crack. You see a son who needs his ma. They see power, you see a child who needs to be held." She turned to face him. "That's your strength, Lysander, not just your alpha power or your bond. It's that you love him, and love, it's a harder target for shadows to hit. It doesn't hide in cells or write messages in blood. It stands in the light and it protects." He finally looked at her, the raw vulnerability back in his eyes. "And if the light isn't enough, if my love is the very flaw they exploit, then we make the light brighter," Ilara said, her voice fierce with a conviction that surprised even her. "We stop hiding him, we stop being afraid of what he is. We show the court, show the kingdom, that Kale isn't just a prophecy or a power source. He's a little boy who laughs and learns and needs to be held. We show them the star has a heartbeat, and we dare anyone to try and steal it." For the first time since the tower, a spark ignited in Lysander's glacial eyes. Not fury, not despair, a wild, defiant hope. The enemy had declared their war in shadows and blood. His answer, he realized, looking from Ilara's determined face to his sleeping son, would be declared in daylight and in love. The next move was his, and it would not be one of defense.
Lysander's resolve, tempered in the fires of betrayal, became the new steel in Argent Keep's spine. The lockdowns and interrogations continued, a necessary, grim purge, but they were no longer the only song. The king began to sing a new one, and its melody was family. He started simply. The next morning, he did not hold court in the grand hall. He held it in the royal gardens, with Ilara by his side and Kale in her arms. He conducted affairs of state while Kale gummed on a teething ring, and when the baby fussed, Lysander didn't dismiss the petitioners. He paused, took Kale onto his own lap, and soothed him with a low rumble that was both kingly and paternal, before calmly returning to the matter of border tariffs. The message was unmistakable. The heir was not a secret to be guarded, but the kingdom's heart beating in the open. He decreed that one afternoon a week, the inner courtyard would be open to the common folk of the capital, the merchants, the artisans, the farmers, and he would be there, with Kale, not on a distant dais, but walking among them. Ilara's heart hammered the first time, a swarm of strangers around her precious charge, but Lysander's presence was a calm, powerful force, and Kale, curious and bright-eyed, seemed to thrive on the genuine, awestruck smiles of the people. They didn't see a monster or a star. They saw a beautiful, peculiar baby who gripped their calloused fingers with his tiny hand and made their king smile a real, unguarded smile. Ilara's role evolved. Lysander didn't just ask for her opinion on Kale. He asked for it on everything. On the design of new shelters for orphaned pups in the city, on trade agreements with human settlements. He listened, truly listened to her perspectives shaped by a life of service on the borders. He began to introduce her not as Kale's guardian, but as Lady Ilara Thorne, my trusted advisor and the heart of my household. The title was unofficial, but its meaning was clear to every watching noble. Lord Corvin and his remaining allies watched this new strategy with icy silence. They could not attack the king for being a father. They could not malign the heir who was winning the people's love with every public gurgle. Their weapon of fear was blunted by a relentless campaign of transparency and heart.
But the true masterstroke was Lysander's handling of Chaol's power. Instead of hiding the manifestations, he acknowledged them. When Chaol, fascinated by a counselor's flickering lantern flame, caused it to burn a steady, brilliant blue, Lysander didn't panic. He laughed, a rich, warm sound. "It seems the air approves of your proposal, counselor, a brighter flame for brighter ideas." He reframed the unknown as a blessing, a sign of favor. The court, so used to dread, began to tentatively view Chaol's abilities with superstitious awe instead of terror. One evening, Lysander came to the nursery after a long day. Chaol was in his crib, finally asleep after a bout of intense teething that had made the cutlery and the entire wing hum sympathetically. Ilara was exhausted, her hair escaping its braid. "Walk with me," Lysander said, his voice quiet. It wasn't a command, but a request. They walked onto the high, secure balcony adjoining her chambers. The kingdom spread below them, a tapestry of twilight and emerging lights. The two moons, one silver, one a pale blue, hung in the sky. "When my father died, he left me a kingdom at war with itself. He left me a crown of thorns and a sword too heavy to lift. My only thought for 10 years has been not to break under the weight, to be the unyielding mountain my people needed." He turned to her, his face etched in the moonlight. "You showed me a mountain can have meadows, that strength can have a gentle side. You and Chaol, you didn't just give me a son, you gave me back my soul." Ilara's breath caught. The raw honesty in his words was a gift more precious than any title. "I have lived by duty alone for so long, but what I feel for you, Ilara, it is not duty. It is the most terrifying and wonderful rebellion of my life. You saw the monster in the crib and called him Chaol. You see the monster on the throne and call him Lysander. You are not afraid of my shadows or my scars or my crown." He took a step closer. The air between them crackled not with magic, but with something equally potent. "I cannot offer you a simple life. This path is fraught with danger, more than ever. But I can offer you my heart, my loyalty, a place not just at my side, but in the very center of my life, as my partner, as my Luna, to raise Chaol together, not as a duty to a prophecy, but as a family built by choice." The world narrowed to the sound of the wind, the distant lights of the city, and the profound hope in his glacier blue eyes. Ilara's mind raced. The dangers were real. Seraphine was still out there. Corvin was plotting. The shadows were waiting. To say yes was to step from the relative safety of being the guardian into the blinding spotlight of being the queen. It was to make herself the ultimate target. But as she looked at him, this mighty, lonely king who had knelt before a baby and now was bearing his heart to a human orphanage keeper, she knew there was no other answer. Her love for Chaol was a root that had grown deep and strong, and somewhere along the way, that root had entwined irrevocably with the man who was his father. "My life was small before. It was about protecting the few I could. You and Chaol, you've shown me my heart is bigger than I ever knew. I'm still afraid, but I'm more afraid of a life where I'm not with you both, facing whatever comes, together." She reached out, her human hand finding his scarred warrior's one. "Yes, Lysander, my answer is yes." He didn't kiss her. He rested his forehead against hers, a profound union, of breaths mingling, of futures aligning. The bond mark on his chest glowed softly, and from the nursery, as if in sleep-bound blessing, Chaol's marks answered with a gentle silver pulse that washed over the balcony like moonlight made liquid. The betrothal was announced at the next full moon gathering, not with a stuffy decree, but with Lysander standing before his entire court, Chaol in one arm, his other hand firmly holding Ilara's. "You have witnessed the return of the firstborn. Now witness the making of his family. This woman, with a courage that defies species and a love that tames storms, will be my Luna. She will be Kael's mother-in-law, as she has been in heart, and she will help me lead this kingdom not just with strength, but with the compassion that is our true foundation." The reaction was a seismic wave. Shock, delight, outrage, hope. It rippled through the crowd. Lord Corvin's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a cold, thwarted fire. He had gambled on fear and isolation. The king had countered with love and unity. The game was not over, but the board had been upended.
As the cheers, some hesitant, some genuine, finally began to rise, Elara stood between her king and her son, her hands in theirs. She was no longer just the protector of the monster pup. She was the promise of his future, the human who had dared to love, and in doing so had helped an alpha king build a new kind of throne, not of fear and cold stone, but of chosen hearts, shining defiantly in the dark. The shadows had not gone, but now they had a much brighter light to contend with. The announcement of the betrothal was a quake that reshaped the landscape of Argent Keep. Overnight, Elara's world contracted and expanded in terrifying, exhilarating ways. Her chambers were flooded with dressmakers, etiquette tutors, and a dizzying array of officials discussing everything from the wedding ceremony to her future household. The title Lady Elara became Your Royal Highness-to-be, a phrase that sounded foreign on the servants' tongues and felt like a suit of ill-fitting armor on her soul. But the true transformation was in the eyes of the court. The veiled contempt from Corvin's faction curdled into open, icy hostility. They no longer bothered with whispered slights. Now they simply turned their backs when she entered a room, or offered bows so shallow they were insults. Their message was clear. A human could never be their Luna. Their resistance had crystallized. Yet, for every cold shoulder, there was a new tentative ally. Mid-ranking nobles, younger sons and daughters, and even some seasoned warriors who admired Lysander's boldness began to approach her with respect. They saw in her not a usurper, but a symbol of the new world Lysander was building, one where merit and heart could outweigh pure bloodline. The court was splitting, and the fissure ran directly between the old guard and the king's vision. Kael, blissfully unaware of the political schism, was the one joy that anchored her. At 6 months old, his personality was blooming. He had a laugh like shattering crystals that made his silver marks dance. He was deeply attached to Leo, who had unofficially become his first playmate and most devoted knight. And his connection with Lysander was a beautiful, wordless dialogue. The king would enter, and Kael would scramble to the edge of his playpen, arms outstretched, his whole body vibrating with joy. The answering glow from Lysander's chest was a sun coming out from behind clouds. It was during a lesson with Kael and Leo, Elara was showing them picture books of animals, that the first tangible strike from the shadows came. Not an arrow, not a beast, but a document. A royal scribe, pale and trembling, was ushered into the nursery by a grim-faced captain. He carried a single piece of vellum sealed not with wax, but with a pressed black thorn. The scent of sorrow wood was faint but unmistakable. "It was found nailed to the great oak in the temple square, Your Majesty," the captain reported. By dawn, copies were appearing all over the lower city. Lysander took it, broke the thorn seal and read. His face, which had been softening in the nursery's warmth, hardened back into the granite mask of the warrior king. He handed it to Elara without a word. The script was the same elegant, spidery hand as the arrow message, but this was no cryptic taunt. It was a legal petition, horrifying in its cold precision. It cited ancient, nearly forgotten laws of lineage and purity. It argued that the bond between Alpha King and Firstborn, while sacred, did not automatically confer legitimacy upon a human consort. It demanded a Luna's trial, a series of 3 traditional challenges meant to test a prospective queen's strength, wisdom, and worthiness to stand beside a werewolf king.
The petition was signed, not by Corvin, but by a coalition of 8 ancient, high-blooded houses. They were using tradition itself as their weapon. "They can't do this," Elara whispered, the vellum shaking in her hands. "You are the king. You've chosen." "I am," Lysander growled, "but these laws, they are older than the kingdom. They were created in a time of chaos to prevent weak alliances. To deny the trial would be to proclaim myself above the very traditions that give the throne its legitimacy. It would give Corvin and his ilk the perfect excuse to name me a tyrant, to rally the traditionalists to open rebellion." He slammed a fist on the table, making the picture books jump. "This is their move. They force me to either expose you to danger in the trials or undermine my own rule by refusing." The Luna trial was a barbaric relic. The challenges were vague, left to the discretion of the High Council, a council currently dominated by Corvin's allies. It could be anything from a feat of physical endurance impossible for a human, to a riddle of wolfish lore she could never know, to a test requiring the use of a power she did not possess. "Then I'll do it," Elara said, the words leaving her mouth before the fear could stop them. Both Lysander and Leo stared at her. "Elara, no," Lysander said, his voice strained. "They will design challenges you can possibly win. The point is not for you to succeed. It is for you to fail publicly, to prove you are unworthy. It could be lethal. If I refuse, they win. They prove I'm afraid, that I'm weak, that everything they say about a human Luna is true. It gives them cause to challenge your rule legally." She met his gaze, a fierce light kindling in her own eyes. "I didn't come this far to hide. I faced down Torin with a baby in my arms. I stood between Kale and a shadow beast. Let them bring their trials. I may not have fangs or magic, but I have something they've never understood. I have everything to fight for." A slow, proud smile spread across Lysander's face, burning away the worry. It was the smile he wore before a battle he knew he could win. "Then we prepare. Not just you, we." The next week was a whirlwind of a different kind. Lysander became her strategist, Gwyn her trainer, and Leo her relentless researcher, scouring the royal archives for every mention of past Luna trials. They were few and brutal. One queen had to track a scent through a blizzard, another had to soothe a raging alpha that was not her mate. The official summons arrived, delivered by a stone-faced Corvin. The trials would be held in 3 days in the ancient Ring of the Ancients, a stone amphitheater at the edge of the forest. The nature of the challenges would be revealed only as they commenced, for the purity of the test, Corvin said, his flinty eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. The night before the first trial, fear was a cold knot in Elara's stomach. She stood on the balcony, the 2 moons bathing her in cold light. Lysander found her there. He didn't offer empty comfort. He stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, sharing the silence. "Remember the first night," he said finally, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "You opened a door to a dying stranger because you saw a child in need. You didn't think, you acted. That instinct, that courage that comes not from power but from love, that is what they cannot prepare for. That is what will be your strength tomorrow." He turned to her, taking both her hands in his. The bond mark on his chest glowed steadily, a promise. "No matter what happens in that ring, Elara Torn, you are already my queen, Kale's mother, my heart's choice. Let the world see what I see." The next morning, dressed in simple, sturdy clothes, her hair braided tightly back, Elara walked with Lysander and a contingent of his most loyal guards to the Ring of the Ancients. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the murmurs of a massive crowd. Nobles, commoners, all gathered to witness the spectacle. In a private booth overlooking the stone circle, Gwyn held Kale, whose silver eyes were wide, his little hand reaching out toward his mother. In the center of the ring stood Lord Corvin and the Council of 8. Corvin's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "The first trial," his voice echoed in the hushed amphitheater, "is the trial of insight.
The Luna must see truth through deception. She must identify from among 10 identical vessels the one that contains the waters of clarity, while the others hold poison. He gestured to a stone table where 10 plain clay cups stood in a row. A test of perception, of inner sight. It was a cruel, elegant trap. A human's senses were dull. She had no wolf's nose to smell the difference, no mystical sense to feel the truth. They expected her to guess, to fail, to possibly drink poison. Ilara walked to the table, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She looked at the cups, all identical. She closed her eyes, seeking the calm she found when singing to Kale. She thought not of poison or water, but of her son, of his trusting gaze, of the pure, clear love that had guided her every step since she found him. And then she felt it, a faint, familiar pull, a gentle silver warmth that had nothing to do with her senses. She opened her eyes and looked up, not at the cups, but at the booth, at Kale. He was staring at the table, his brow furrowed in concentration. The marks on his arm, the one closest to her, were glowing with a soft, steady light. As her eyes scanned the cups, his glow flickered slightly when she looked at the 7th one. It steadied, grew a fraction brighter. He was helping her, not with a storm, not with a blast of power, but with the quiet, guiding connection they had always shared. He was her insight. Without hesitation, Ilara reached out and picked up the 7th cup. She raised it to her lips, her eyes locked on Corvin's. She took a sip. It was water, cool and sweet. A roar of astonishment and applause erupted from the crowd. Corvin's smile vanished, replaced with a flash of stunned fury. He hadn't accounted for the bond between mother and child, a bond that operated on a frequency far older and deeper than any wolfish law. Ilara lowered the cup, the taste of victory and clear water on her tongue. She looked at Lysander, who was staring at her with fierce, glowing pride, and then at Kale, who gave a happy, gummy smile. One trial down. The Shadow's gambit had failed its first strike, but as the crowd's cheers washed over her, Ilara knew the next challenges would be harder. The enemies in the light were just getting started. The triumph of the first trial was a sweet, defiant note in a gathering symphony of tension. The crowd's cheers for Ilara were genuine, a wave of support from the common folk who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles against the rigid hierarchies of the old blood. But in the nobles' stands, the silence from Corvin's faction was louder than any boo. Back in the sanctuary of her chambers, the adrenaline bled away, leaving Ilara trembling. Kale, seemingly exhausted from his subtle guidance, slept deeply. Lysander dismissed the attendants and drew her to a seat by the fire, holding her hands between his own, his warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "You were magnificent," he murmured, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "But he helped you." It wasn't an accusation, it was an odd observation. I felt him, just a nudge, a certainty. It was like when he calms for my song, but in reverse. He was speaking to me without words. Lysander's expression grew thoughtful, the firelight carving deep shadows into his face. The bond between Aethan and Firstborn is of power and legacy, but this between you and him is something else. It's primal. It's the first language before prophecies or thrones. It's the language of a child and his mother. He looked at me, his blue eyes intense. They will have anticipated this. The next trial will be designed to sever that connection, to isolate you. He was right. The summons for the second trial arrived at dawn. It was to take place at noon in the Whispering Grove, a sacred stand of ancient sentient trees within the royal forest. The nature of the trial was cryptically stated. The trial of the pack heart. The Luna must prove her understanding of the wolf's soul, beyond the touch of a child. The phrasing was a deliberate slap. It dismissed her bond with Kale as mere maternal instinct, irrelevant to the true essence of werewolf nature. Ilara's stomach coiled with dread. How could she, a human, prove she understood the wolf's soul? The Whispering Grove was a place of profound, eerie quiet.
the massive trees seemed to lean in, their leaves murmuring secrets on a wind Ilara couldn't feel. The Council of Eight stood in a semicircle. Corvin stepped forward, his manner smug. The wolf's heart is ruled by primal truths: loyalty, protection, the defense of the vulnerable. He gestured, and from behind the trees 3 figures were led forward, their hands bound, sacks over their heads. Ilara's blood ran cold. "These 3 prisoners," Corvin announced, his voice echoing in the hushed grove, "are condemned for treason against the crown. Their sentences are death. The trial is simple, Luna to be. You must choose one to spare, the one you deem most worthy of mercy. The other 2 will meet their fate at sunset. Choose correctly, and you prove you can discern the heart of a wolf, even a flawed one. Choose poorly, you reveal a human sentimentality, blind to true justice." It was monstrous, a psychological trap of exquisite cruelty. She was being forced to play executioner, to choose who lived and who died based on no evidence, no testimony. It was a test of gut instinct, of a wolf's supposed ability to smell guilt or redemption. As a human, she was set up to fail, to be branded either a bleeding heart or a capricious tyrant. The sacks were removed. The first prisoner was a grizzled, older warrior, his face a map of scars, his eyes burning with defiant hatred. The second was a young woman, barely more than a girl, trembling, her eyes wide with animal terror. The third was a middle-aged man, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in abject despair. The council watched her, their faces impassive. Lysander, standing to the side as an observer only, was a statue of controlled rage. He could not interfere. Ilara walked forward, her legs like wood. She looked at each face. The warrior's hatred was a shield. The girl's terror was a scream. The man's despair was a void. How could she choose? What metric of wolf's heart could she possibly use? She closed her eyes, trying to find the calm she reached during the first trial, but there was no gentle nudge from Kale here. He was back at the keep, too far away. She was alone. Primal truths, Corvin had said. Loyalty, protection, the defense of the vulnerable. Her mind flashed not to wolfish lore, but to her own life, to the Haven. She thought of the children who arrived, some angry and scarred like the warrior, some terrified like the girl, some broken and silent like the man. She had never judged their worthiness for care. She had simply protected, because they were vulnerable. She opened her eyes and walked straight to the young girl. She didn't look at Corvin. She looked at the girl, seeing not a traitor but a child, terrified. "I spare this one," Ilara said, her voice clear in the murmuring grove. A flicker of surprise, then disdain crossed Corvin's face. "Sentiment, the weak one. Explain your choice." Ilara turned to face the council, her chin high. "You speak of the wolf's heart defending the vulnerable. A true alpha, a true leader, protects the weakest member of the pack without question. That is the first law, is it not? Not to cull them, but to shield them, to make them strong. If this one is guilty, then her punishment should be redemption, not death. To kill her in cold blood here proves nothing but a taste for cruelty, which is the antithesis of a true leader's heart." Her words rang out, turning their own rhetoric against them. She hadn't tried to smell guilt or redemption. She had applied a universal law of protection, a human law, yes, but one that mirrored the very best of wolfish pack principles. Before Corvin could retort, the slumped, middle-aged prisoner lifted his head. Tears streamed down his face. She is my daughter," he choked out, his voice raw. "I am the traitor. I conspired. She knew nothing. She was only trying to find me when they captured her. Please, kill me. Spare her." The truth, wrung from a father's despair, exploded in the grove. The girl sobbed. Ilara had chosen correctly, not by sensing treason, but by choosing mercy for the most vulnerable. She had, in fact, protected the innocent. Corvin's face was purple with suppressed fury. He had been outmaneuvered by compassion.
The council members shifted uncomfortably. The trial had revealed not Ilara's ignorance, but the cold, calculating brutality of their opponents. "The trial is concluded," one of the older council members, a lord who had remained neutral, said quietly but firmly. "The Luna-to-be has shown insight into the core principle of pack. She passes." As the guards led the weeping father away and unbound the sobbing girl, Ilara felt no triumph, only a sick, hollow relief. She had won, but the cost was a glimpse into the abyss of their politics. They would use lives as chess pieces without a second thought. Lysander was at her side in an instant, his hand on the small of her back, a solid, grounding presence. "You saw the heart of it," he murmured into her ear, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the wolf's heart, the heart. You saw what they have all forgotten." That night, as a cold rain began to fall, mirroring the gloom in Ilara's soul, a sealed note was slipped under her door. It was on plain parchment, unsigned. It contained only 3 words. "The third is death." It was no longer a trial, it was a death sentence. The final challenge would not be designed for her to fail, it would be designed for her to die. The shadows had run out of subtlety, the mask was off. The wolf's heart had been tested, and now the enemy was coming for hers with naked, final intent. The real battle for her life and for the future of the throne would be fought tomorrow. The unsigned note lay on the table like a dead thing, its 3 words screaming in the silent room. "The third is death." Ilara stared at it, the hollow victory from the grove turning to ice in her veins. This was no longer a test of worthiness, it was an execution warrant. Lysander's reaction was volcanic. He wanted to call off the trials, to disband the council, to march on Corvin's estate with his entire guard. "I will not deliver you to slaughter for the sake of tradition," he roared, the alpha power in his voice making the crystal gulpits shiver. "I know, but if you do that, you prove their point," Ilara said, her voice unnervingly calm. She felt detached, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. "You prove a human Luna makes you irrational, a tyrant who tramples the old ways. It gives them the righteous cause they need for open rebellion. The kingdom would fracture, Lysander, and in the chaos, what would happen to Kale?" The mention of their son was the only thing that could quell the storm in him. He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. "Then what? I am to send you into a pit with a smiling assassin? To watch?" "We fight their game," Ilara said, the strategic mind that had run an orphanage on a knife's edge clicking into place. "But we change the rules. They've announced the trial will be the trial of the crown, a test of a ruler's mettle in the face of overwhelming force. It will be combat. They'll claim it's symbolic, but they'll field a champion meant to kill me. We cannot refuse. So we accept, but we name the terms." Lysander looked up, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "What terms?" "The Luna stands for the protection of the pack, so the trial is not a duel to death. It is a trial of defense. My champion defends me against their champion. If their champion reaches me, I fail. If my champion defeats theirs, I pass. It stays within the theme of crown. A ruler relies on loyal protectors." "A champion?" Lysander began to smile, a fierce, wolfish expression. "I will be your champion." "You can't," Ilara said gently. "You are the king, the prize. It would be seen as you fighting your own battle, not me proving my worth to command loyalty. It must be someone else, someone whose loyalty to me is unquestionable." They both fell silent. Who? Gwyn was loyal, but a beta against a battle-hardened alpha champion would be a death sentence. The royal guards were loyal to the king, not specifically to her. A quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "I will do it." Weo stood there, having overheard everything. His 12-year-old frame was trembling, but his eyes were steady, blazing with a conviction that belied his age. "I am loyal to her, to Ilara. She saved me. She saved Kale. She's my family." "Leo, no," Alara started, her heart breaking. "He's a child," Lysander growled. "I am a wolf," Leo shot back, his voice cracking with passion. "I am not a strong one, not yet, but they will not expect me. Their champion will be an alpha expecting another alpha, or at least a warrior. They will underestimate me, and I would die for her. That is the loyalty of the pack, isn't it? The weakest defending the heart?" He threw Alara's own words from the grove back at her. Lysander studied the boy, seeing not a child but the raw material of a formidable man. He saw the same stubborn, selfless courage that had drawn Lysander to Alara. "He's right about one thing," the king said slowly. "They will underestimate him. It is a gamble of terrible odds, but it is a gambit they will not foresee." The plan was insane, but it was the only move on a board rigged against them.
The final trial was held in the great arena of Argent Keep, under a sky the color of lead. The stands were packed to bursting, a sea of anxious, eager faces. The air thrummed with bloodlust and morbid curiosity. Alara stood in a designated circle of white stones at the arena's center, dressed in a simple gray gown, a stark contrast to the spectacle. Lord Corvin announced the modified terms, his mouth a tight line of displeasure at the alteration, but he could not refuse without looking afraid. So be it, the trial of the crown, a test of the Luna's command of loyalty and defense. He gestured, and from the opposite gate his champion emerged. It was Brutus, a mountain of an alpha from Corvin's personal guard. He wore minimal armor, his muscles coiled like steel springs, his eyes glowing with savage amber light. He carried a massive spiked club. A low, approving rumble came from Corvin's supporters. Then, from the gate behind Alara, her champion walked out. A collective, disbelieving gasp swept the arena, then laughter. Mocking, cruel laughter. It was a boy, a skinny, serious-faced boy with a practice sword that looked like a toy in his hands. Brutus threw back his head and laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "This is your shield, human? A pup still wet behind the ears? I will not even need the club." Leo walked to a point halfway between Alara and Brutus. He did not look at the giant. He looked at Alara and gave a single, firm nod. Then he set his feet, raising his practice sword. Corvin gave the signal. Brutus charged with a roar, not with strategy, but with contemptuous, overwhelming force, intending to swat the boy aside like a fly and then stride to Alara. Leo did not move to meet him. He dropped his sword. The crowd gasped again. Was he surrendering? Then, as Brutus was mere feet away, Leo did the only thing he could. He shifted. His shift was not the controlled, powerful transformation of an adult. It was a messy, painful-looking explosion of limbs and fur, leaving a scrawny, adolescent wolf with oversized paws and frightened eyes. He was not a threat. He was a pathetic, trembling pup. Brutus, mid-charge, hesitated for a split second, thrown by the sheer absurdity. That split second was all Lysander needed. From the royal box, his alpha command slammed into the arena, not as an attack, but as a directive, focused and immense. "Halt!" The command was not aimed at Brutus's body, but his wolfish essence. Every wolf in the arena, including Brutus, froze as if struck by lightning, the primal instinct to obey an alpha king's direct order overriding all else. Brutus skidded to a stop, his club dropping from nerveless fingers, his body locked in place, trembling with the effort to resist. In that frozen moment, Leo, in his gangly wolf form, scrambled forward. He didn't attack, he did something far more brilliant. He darted between Brutus's legs, a blur of brown fur, and lunged not for the man, but for the discarded club. With a strength born of pure desperation, he clamped his jaws on the leather grip and with a frantic tug dragged the massive weapon back across the sand, away from Brutus, toward Alara's circle. The spectacle was so unexpected, so utterly outside the bounds of honorable combat, that for a moment no one moved. Then the crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in howls of outrage and peals of incredulous laughter.
Lysander released his command. Brutus stumbled, free from the compulsion, humiliation burning hotter than any battle fury on his face. He looked at his empty hands, at the boy wolf now dropping his club at the edge of Alara's white circle, panting heavily. "The champion is disarmed," Lysander's voice boomed, leveraging the chaos. "By the modified terms of the trial, the Luna's champion has successfully defended her circle by neutralizing the threat. The trial of the crown is concluded." Corvin was on his feet, screaming about trickery, about dishonor. But the damage was done. The crowd was divided, buzzing with the insane story they would tell for generations. The human Luna hadn't fielded a warrior, she'd fielded a child whose loyalty was so absolute he'd turned the trial into a farce, exposing the brute force approach of her enemies as clumsy and stupid. She had defended her crown not with strength, but with cunning and the unbreakable loyalty of the most unexpected heart. In the center of the arena, Brutus, humiliated beyond bearing, let out a roar of pure rage. Shame overrode all reason. Forgetting the trial, forgetting the king, he shifted into his own massive wolf form and lunged for Alara in her circle, fangs bared for the kill. It was the final, naked truth of their intent. But he never reached her. A silver blur shot from the royal box. It was Lysander, moving faster than sight, a black wolf with eyes of glacial fire. He intercepted Brutus mid-leap. The clash was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Lysander's jaws closed on the other wolf's throat with a sound that silenced the arena. He did not kill him, he held him, suspended, a growl vibrating the very air, a display of absolute dominance. He shifted back to his human form, holding the now shifted, choking Brutus by the neck. He looked up at Corvin's box. "This," he roared, his voice echoing with final, kingly judgment. "This is the true trial failed, not by my Luna, but by you. You sought to murder under the guise of tradition. You are corrupt. You are a poison in this kingdom's heart." He threw Brutus to the sand like garbage. "Lord Corvin and all who stand with him in this treason are hereby stripped of titles and lands. You are exiled from Viridia. By sunset, or you will share this traitor's fate." The verdict was absolute. The gambit was over. The shadows had been dragged into the light and banished. As guards moved to seize the sputtering Corvin, Alara walked out of her circle. She went first to Leo, who had shifted back, pale and shaking. She hugged him tightly, her thank you lost in his hair. Then she walked across the sand to stand beside Lysander, who was breathing heavily, the storm in his eyes clearing, replaced by an exhaustion deeper than any battle fatigue and a love more powerful than any crown. The crowd was silent, waiting. Alara turned to face them, her human voice carrying in the hushed arena. "You have seen 3 trials, one of insight, won by a mother's bond, one of the heart, won by mercy for the weak, one of the crown, won by the loyalty of a child." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This is the pack I will help build, not one of fear and perfect strength, but one where every bond, every act of courage, and every loyal heart has value. This is the only crown I want." She took Lysander's hand, and together they turned their backs on the arena, walking away from the sand and the shadows toward the archway where Gwyn waited with Kale. His baby reached for them, his silver eyes bright, his marks glowing with a soft, steady light, as if approving the new world his human mother and wolf king father had just fought to create. The trials were over. The real work of building that kingdom of chosen hearts was just beginning.